Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
Well, there's not going to be a return to austerity under a Labour government. Well, we had austerity for 5 years, and that is part of the reason why our economy and our public services are in a mess today. There is no spending review. The government haven't done a spending review, so there's no allocations for departments. I would have to do that if I become Chancellor in a few weeks' time, and I'll set out those plans.
So Rachel Reeves speaking there to the BBC last May, before, of course, she got her job as Chancellor. Will she be able to keep her promise now? You're listening to Bloomberg UK Politics. I'm Stephen Carroll.
And I'm Yuan. Welcome to the programme. So, pretty emphatic there from the Chancellor. The UK won't see a return to the austerity of the Conservative years. But now it seems the government is staring down the barrel of more public spending freezes. Bloomberg reporting today has revealed that the Treasury has told several government departments to prepare for budgets to be frozen in cash terms. So that is effectively a cut after inflation. This is all part of the big spending review planned in June, setting out budgets for the 3 years from 2026. We know that after October's budget, which increased borrowing and taxes, of course, the government has more money to play with this year. But the years later in the Parliament were always going to be tighter. But what's going to make that tightness really hurt is that the government's borrowing costs have gone up since the budget. No joke, when you owe £2.8 trillion. And the period since the summer has seen UK economic growth basically add up to a big fat zero.
Look, the last thing the Chancellor's going to want to do is to have to introduce austerity, although I do wonder if flat cash, which is a key part of this story, is going to be the new word for austerity as we consider the trajectory of the public finances. Of course, before the election, and we heard a little bit of that commentary from Rachel Reeves there, the messaging from Labour was very much around painting the Conservative era of politics as being cruel due to austerity. Of course, the party also promised, though, to rebuild Britain's public finances, which in itself is no small and certainly not a cheap task. So the numbers are pretty grim, and we've already made certain promises. It seems like there might only be bad choices left to be made, Yuan.
Yeah, but with us today is our economics reporter, Tom Rees. Now, Tom, let's start with a bit of context. How bad is the fiscal situation right now?
It's not ideal, and it's slightly self-inflicted as well, because whether you remember back in October, Reeves left herself about 10 billion of headroom, fiscal headroom, before she breaks her fiscal rules. And that might sound like quite a lot, but actually quite small changes to the forecast that we get from the OBR in March would wipe that out. And we saw that, earlier in January, market moves, and there was a lot of speculation about how she basically didn't have any money left because bond yields had risen so much. We've seen that reverse, but, we still think that she's lost some money because of the moves that we've had on markets since October. And there's always the big threat for her is growth downgrades from the OBR. If the OBR reduce their productivity growth assumptions by 0.2 percentage points, that would wipe out 17 billion in her budget plan. So that's the big threat. I mean, the OBR, maybe they don't take a view now and take a view in the autumn and, give her a bit of a stay of execution. But given how bad the growth data has been in the last couple of months, that could be the big risk for her.
So the timing of all of this is very interesting, because the Office of Budget Responsibility, the OBR, will be giving their first version of their forecast to Rachel Reeves today, and the actual next public review that we get from the OBR isn't until until next month. But all of that still looking like quite a tight timeline for I suppose, being able to have all of those calculations and understand just how bad the picture is. So in the meantime, we've been doing our reporting about what departments are being asked to look at in their own budgets. What is being asked of them?
Essentially, if we separate the government departments into protected and unprotected departments, so protected departments are kind of health, education, defence. They're fine. Reeves announced an increase in the overall spending envelope for the coming years of about 50 billion. Most of that is going to be gobbled up by health for obvious reasons, given the NHS is kind of still really struggling. Defence, when you've got Trump, knocking on your door saying, can you spend more and defend yourself? That's another one. And there's always a need in education. So they're fine. The problem is in these unprotected departments. So these are places like justice, local government, transport, just all the other stuff that is slightly lower down the priority list. That's where any kind of spending cuts are going to be felt. So this idea of her asking them to do flat cash, and that obviously meaning that, in real terms, relatively big cuts, that's going to fall on places like justice where, they've had massive court backlogs, prisons are overflowing. So it's going to be painful. And let's remember that these unprotected departments were the ones that faced the big cuts the first time around under George Osborne in the first half of the 2010s. So a lot of fat was trimmed back then. Those departments look quite lean. Can Reeves find any more fat to trim? That's what we're going to find out.
And just for avoidance of doubt, the flat cash is where essentially the budget, the number is going to be the same, but because inflation is going up, essentially in real terms, you have less money to be able to spend. Yuan.
And just to put a bit more flesh on that, so the numbers were looking pretty tight for these non-protected departments anyway, weren't they? As we sort of look out into the latter part of the Parliament, because the way the budget worked is there was quite a big chunk of cash in the immediate term, and then that kind of fizzles out, doesn't it? How tight was it, and how much worse could it get if things go the wrong way for Rachel Reeves?
So what the plans that she set out in October implied. So we didn't know we only find out in June at the spending review, exactly how she's going to divide up the total
square the circle, essentially.
Yeah, and sort of divide up the total spending envelope. But what it implied at least was that unprotected departments, so those ones I was talking about earlier, justice, etc. It looked about £9 billion they were going to have to cut from their day-to-day spending, which is quite a lot. It's not quite kind of Osborne levels of austerity, but it's still
£9 billion
painful.
in cash terms, is it?
That's in real terms, so quite a lot of money to find. And the risk is just, as we were discussing before, if the OBR, moves its forecast in certain ways, that number just has to get bigger and bigger if you want to be as generous as you were being with health and defence, etc.
So this is, to put it in context, this is not the same as what we became known as the period of austerity in the 2010s in terms of how much is being cut. These would be smaller numbers of reduction, but coming after, of course, a period where there has been a tightness of funding for all these departments. Yes,
smaller scale, but still very painful when you've already had to go through it the first time. I'm sure some of those departments were probably pretty pleased to, hear Rachel Reeves say last year, we're not going to return to austerity after having to be so lean in recent years. And they must be dreading how they're going to find savings and efficiencies another time around.
And are there any other options on the table for the Chancellor? Of course, we had a mention just within the last week of reforms to the welfare budget. We know that sickness benefits currently costing £65 billion a year. That's set to rise to £100 billion by the end of the Parliament. That's surely somewhere where the government's going to look for some savings.
Absolutely. Welfare is one that they've kind of zeroed in on, and it feels like an obvious choice. I mean, I guess the difficulty there is the internal politics of the Labour Party, and how, depending on how deep those cuts are, you wonder whether that's going to spark some rebellion. But it's worth remembering that the welfare budget has, since the pandemic, risen a lot, especially kind of in the health benefits. So the people do see a kind of need to kind of cut back there. And then in terms of other options, I mean, the only other two ways you can sort of find the money is tax rises, which I think she'll be pretty reticent to do, given how badly, or the reaction to the tax rises that we got in October. And then it's all this stuff about supply side reforms. Can she convince the OBR that what she's doing, stuff like Heathrow runways, etc., can that actually boost the UK's potential growth rate? And the OBR didn't seem quite convinced in the autumn, and they are already at the optimistic end of forecasts on our potential growth rate. So that doesn't really look like a really viable avenue either. So it is definitely a tricky one.
Tom, I wanted to ask you about another story that you've been reporting on as well, which is related to this, which is to do with the economic data. We've talked a lot about how the Office for National Statistics has been trying to essentially make its data more accurate, which speaks to some of the calculation problems you were just referring to. They've got some new ideas. What are they planning to do that might give us better information about the state of the economy?
Yeah, so the ONS have been kind of struggling to get enough responses to their labour market survey, and basically people think that their data on unemployment, employment, economic inactivity is useless, and Bank of England policymakers are pretty frank in saying so. So the ONS are trying to transition to a new survey, which they hope will have much higher responses, and they're trying a few things, a few kind of novel strategies in order to kind of help boost response rates. So they're moving to an online survey, and they're kind of hoping to have this kind of AI, generative AI, that will be almost like a chatbot that will kind of speak to the person answering the survey and trying to narrow.
How many jobs do you have?
Yeah, exactly. They've found some challenges of trying to like narrow down people's answers. So like, what job you do might not necessarily fit exactly into the right basket. So they're hoping this AI will kind of speak to the person and find out,
resolve some of the confusion, perhaps.
Hopefully. And then the other thing they're doing that's quite interesting is they're kind of using behavioural psychology to boost responses. So they're having a problem where people just refuse to respond at the moment, and they already have incentives like cash incentives like 25, 50 quid to try and get people to respond. But that hasn't really helped. So what they're doing is they're paying people regardless of whether they fill out the survey. And the psychology behind it is that more people fill out the survey because they feel some sort of guilt or something, of being given some money and not actually, doing nothing for it. So. Yeah.
It's fascinating, the psychology around how surveys are conducted. So very interesting to see the ONS reacting to that as well, and kind of I suppose looking for better ways to do things in the future. I'm sure it's not just a UK problem. I'm sure this is something that's being considered elsewhere as well.
Yeah, I mean the UK's definitely had the worst of it, but I've been doing some reporting with some colleagues in the US. The US are having falling response rates as well. So we're definitely the worst, but there's everyone else is kind of just behind us.
Yeah, figuring it out. Okay, yeah. Tom Rees, our economics reporter, thank you very much for joining us. Yuan, I think this speaks to some of the difficult political choices that'll have to be made in the coming weeks by the Chancellor as well. We'll be watching with keen interest to see what those latest OBO forecasts will reveal. That's it from us for today. If you like the programme, don't forget to subscribe. Give it 5 stars so other people can find it on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or wherever you listen.
This episode was produced by Tiwa Adebayo and our audio engineer was Sean Gostamakia. I'm Yuan Potts.
And I'm Stephen Carroll. We'll be back with more tomorrow. This is Bloomberg.
Bloomberg UK Politics. Listen weekdays at noon on DAB Digital Radio in London.